So, hello everyone. Welcome to the second webinar of the Borderland Working Group organized by the Center for Öresund Region Studies at Lund University. I want to thank all of you for joining today, especially to our contributors who have generously agreed to animate the conversations we will be having over the coming months, and especially today. I want to single out a very special thanks also to Joanna Rivano Ekerdal and Mia Krokstad from the Center for Öresund Region Studies. Their support has absolutely made this seminar possible. So the Borderland Working Group is an informal association of researchers, artists, practitioners from across southern Scandinavia studying the culture and spaces of borders. Taking a broad concept of dwelling employed across very diverse professional and disciplinary fields as our starting point, the goal of this seminar is to explore comparative and methodological approaches to the way borderlands are lived, experienced, and inhabited in the Öresund region of southern Scandinavia and beyond. Specifically, we ask what methods, frameworks, and practices we can draw upon to better understand how dwelling occurs in different borderlands. How do modes of inhabitation transform as boundaries become more permeable and restrictive and fragmented? And how can these comparative, methodological, and representational gestures be brought to bear on the way that we talk about borderlands across professional and disciplinary frontiers? So for our second meeting today, we're going to consider Mediterraneanism as a form of border thinking, drawing lessons specifically from the Sicilian borderland. And as a starting point, I want to begin with a comment written by our discussants today, Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez, who warns us against an overly statist vision of integration between socially and ethnically diverse communities. Instead, Encarna has advocated for the creolization of how we approach coexistence and conviviality when she writes, "Considering the spontaneous and relational character of our lives, but also our emotional and material dependence on others, makes us realize that we constantly transgress the imagined boundaries set by monocultural and monolingual prescriptions. Relationalities are guided by needs, feelings, affects, and desires that bring us together in unexpected ways. It is in this regard that our relationships unfold in transversal ways, converging and diverging at different points. Creolization is informed by transversal vital forces moving us in different directions and embracing the principles of interconnectedness and interdependence." And then she also writes, translated into the European context, creolization invites us methodologically into an analysis of the poetics of relation and the conceptualization of transversal becomings. And so to my mind, actually, this vision of transversal conviviality raises a number of important considerations that our first speaker, Ilaria Giglioli, will be exploring in her talk today. So Ilaria is a scholar of migration, borders, and racialization based at the University of San Francisco. A geographer by training, she studies the creation, legitimation, and contestation of borders with a comparative focus on the Mediterranean and US southern borderlands. She is particularly interested in illuminating the social, political, and economic processes that generate support for border fortification, territorial difference, and inequality, as well as the social movements against these events. Her presentation today, I think most importantly, as to flag us for the future, is part of a much larger book project that is entitled Unmaking the Mediterranean Border, Race, Space, and Coloniality at Europe's Southern Periphery. So after Ilaria's talk, we'll take a 5-minute pause to let us sort of gather our thoughts about her presentation. And when we return, we will have our second speaker, Professor Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez, lead the discussion comments. So based at the Goethe-Universität Frankfurt am Main, Encarna's research draws on post-Marxist and decolonial perspectives, as well as feminist and queer epistemologies to examine broad theoretical questions related to the fields of coloniality and migration, racial capitalism, labor, culture, and inequality, and their local articulations in Germany, Spain, and the UK. She's currently on the chair of the section of Women and Gender Studies of the German Sociology Association, and also serves on the board of the European Sociology Association's 32nd Research Network on the Sociology of Migration, among many other important responsibilities. So welcome, Ilaria and Encarna. Without further ado, Ilaria, when you are ready, you can start sharing your screen and begin your presentation as soon as you are ready.
Thank you so much. Can you just give me 1 minute? Excuse me 1 second, and I'll be right with you.
Sure. We won't count this as part of the 5 minutes. Whenever you're
So
ready, Lara.
thank you.
Don't worry.
Yes, no problem. All right, so thank you so much for inviting me, Bill and everyone. It's really my pleasure to present my work today. And I'm particularly happy to present my work to a group of border scholars based in the EU, particularly because I'm just going to be discussing the concept of borderlands from the standpoint of Southern Europe specifically. So without further ado, let me start my presentation. All right, can everyone see my slides? Perfect. So as Bill mentioned, my presentation is entitled Mediterraneanism as a Form of Border Thinking, a Critical Look at Coexistence in the Sicilian Borderland. And really the purpose of my talk today is to investigate the extent to which both everyday relations between people of migrant and Italian descent and the public celebrations of mixing in the southwestern Sicilian town of Mazara del Vallo can represent a model of coexistence and inclusion of racialized populations, specifically in a moment of rising nationalisms. Now, the stakes of this project are made evident by the fact that we're currently living a period of global border closure, understood both as the physical fortification of borders, but also as the rise of exclusionary forms of nationalism that cast migrants and refugees as external threats to the nation. So in other words, we're really living in a moment in which the nation state, as a default unit of social political organization and a default arena of belonging, has returned with force. So in this moment of re-entrenchment of the nation state, it's tempting to look towards borderlands as a space that calls into question the naturalness of borders, thanks to a long-standing thick web of cross-border connections, but also as a space from which alternative understandings of belonging to narrow nationalist ones can emerge. But before going into this in more detail, I'd like to briefly reflect on the term borderlands itself, which I know is very much the focus of this working group. So when I use the term borderlands, I'm really drawing on literature in human geography and a field known in the US as critical ethnic studies, which looks towards the borderland as a space that can help us denaturalize the nation state. Now, much of this scholarship really refers to sort of hard national borders, particularly when they coincide with broader notions of civilizational divides, such as the Mediterranean or the US-Mexico border. But in general, this literature really understands borderlands in three ways: as a sort of physical ribbon flanking the borderline, as the specific social, political, and cultural characteristics of this area, but also in a broader metaphorical sense as a claim to hybridity or hybrid identity. So with regards to the first two meanings, scholars understand borderlands to be unique sites that question any kind of naturalness of borders, as well as assumptions about their cultural homogeneity of the nation state, precisely because of a long history and thick web of cross-border social and economic relations. And they assume that they have a sort of cultural hybridity deriving from a long history of cultural exchange, as well as an often larger population of migrant descent in other parts of the nation. So there's the assumption that borderlands might represent a particularly open and accepting place for populations of migrant descent, particularly if they've historically been racialized or considered external from the nation. Now, with regards to the use of borderlands in a metaphorical sense, some scholars use the term as a claim to and a revendication of hybrid identity. For instance, Gloria Anzaldúa, a Chicana scholar originally from the US-Mexico border region in southern Texas, claims a borderland identity as a means to give dignity to in-between population of Chicanos, right? People of Mexican descent in the US, who are often discriminated both by Anglo-Americans and looked down upon by Latin American nationals. Well, Argentine sociologist Walter Mignolo, in turn, coined the term border thinking in a broader metaphorical sense as a means to celebrate the in-between position of subjects who are familiar with and thus can theorize simultaneously from dominant and subordinate worldviews. Now, in both of these understandings, then, the celebration of the in-betweenness of the border represents a broader means to celebrate and recognize marginalized populations and their worldviews. So my own research grounds this conceptual discussion of borderlands in the specific geography of southwestern Sicily, focusing both on everyday interactions between people of Italian and Tunisian descent in the space, but also on public celebrations of mixing and interconnection that emerge from here. Now, within this region, The city of Mazara del Vallo in particular represents the epitome of the Mediterranean borderland. Indeed, the city has a long history of connection with Tunisia. The region of Trapani, where it's located, was a source of emigration to Tunisia between the late 19th and early 20th century, when the country was a French protectorate. In the 1960s, this migratory movement changed direction as Tunisians began to migrate to work north in Mazara del Vallo's fishing boats. This means that Mazara hosts one of the oldest North African communities in Italy. However, connections with Tunisia go beyond migration. The town's fishing fleet had a long history of fishing conflicts with the Tunisian government, and in order to support the interests of the fleet, the local political class developed strong connections with Tunisian diplomatic authorities, members of local government, and entrepreneurs. Most recently, Mazara has really marketed itself as a site of coexistence between Italians and Tunisians, and it's renowned within Italy for this reason. So it was precisely Mazara del Vallo's reputation as an epitome of a Mediterranean borderland that led me to focus on this city to pose two broader questions. Firstly, I sought to understand the extent to which the city's long history of cross-Mediterranean connections, including its two-way migratory history with Tunisia and the supposedly hybrid culture that emerged from this history, rendered it a particularly welcoming space for Tunisian migrants and people of Tunisian descent. So in broader terms, I sought to understand the extent to which daily relations between people of different backgrounds in this borderland both challenged symbolic boundaries of the nation upheld in other parts of the country, but also provide a model of co-presence of people of different backgrounds that could be reproduced elsewhere. Secondly, I examined the extent to which the hybrid Mediterraneanist politics, in other words, the public celebration of cross-Mediterranean connections embraced by the city's political, economic, and intellectual elite, challenged material and symbolic closure of national borders. In broader terms, could this kind of Mediterraneanist celebration represent a sort of border thinking that can celebrate hybridity, recognize and value the presence and contribution of people of migrant descent? So with these questions in mind, I arrived to Mazara del Vallo in early 2014 to attend the Tunisia Mare Nostrum face-to-face meeting. This was one of a series of meetings with migrant communities organized throughout Italy by the National Ministry of Labor and Social Policy and sponsored by the city. On the day of the event, about half the seats of the conference hall in the municipality were filled by Tunisians and Italian-Tunisian descent, as activists had spent weeks organizing the community to attend in order to voice their concerns. Following a series of short speeches by different Italian authorities focused on commonalities between the northern and southern shore of the Mediterranean, it was time for the voices of the Tunisian community. Once a woman of Tunisian descent in her mid-20s took the floor. I certainly appreciate that you created a program for integration. However, today I would like to start from Article 1 of the Italian Constitution. Italy is a republic founded on work. Now, to have work means to have a life, a salary, something that 80% of my community does not have. The facilitator smiled nervously, pushing Ons to wrap up. In Mazara, all the seamen who arrived in the 70s and 80s are unemployed or cannot access their pensions. Why? Because their employers never contributed to Social Security, or because they cannot become permanent residents. To become permanent residents, what do they need? A basic income that goes up every year. Does the minister ever put himself in our shoes? To work on boats, immigrants need a residence permit, but to get a permit, they need a job. What are they supposed to do? As Ons concluded her remarks, the audience became more animated. By the time a representative of the Ministry of Labor closed the meeting, many Tunisians had already left the room, frustrated by the lack of answer to Ons's questions. Now, the tensions that exploded at the Tunisia Mare Nostrum meeting were a common occurrence, because over the course of the year, people of Tunisian descent interrupted and contested multiple similar events that showcased relations between Sicilians and Tunisians in the town. Because despite the proliferation of celebrations of Mazara as a showcase of Mediterranean cosmopolitanism, the combination of economic crisis, restrictive immigration legislation, and a long history of precarious labor had put Tunisians in the most precarious situation they'd ever been in Mazara. Now, in order to fully understand the causes of the precariousness, it's important to broaden the scope of our analysis from Mazara itself to understand how this borderland was embedded within broader economic transformations at the national and European scale. Now, by the early 2000s, traditional sectors of employment of people of Tunisian descent in the city, fishing and agriculture, were undergoing structural changes that would affect employment and wages. With regards to fishing, since the mid-90s, national subsidies that had supported the sector had been cut as part of a reorganization of Italian regional development programs to bring them in line with EU guidelines. So the rise of operational costs had led to the crisis of smaller businesses and a consequent drop in employment. At the same time, in agriculture, the EU's common agricultural policies push for specialization, and the incorporation of small family businesses into large distribution networks had led to a rise in competition among small farmers who survived and competed by pushing down the cost of labor by employing migrants well below the nationally regulated agricultural pay scale. So these structural transformations, on top of a long history of informal labor and undocumented migration, had made the situation of people of Tunisian descent particularly vulnerable by the second decade of the 21st century. So in particular, the Tunisian community in the town had three concerns: precarious labor conditions, difficulties in acquiring immigration papers and citizenship, and obstacles in accessing pensions. Now, finding a good job had always been difficult for people of Tunisian descent in this region. But by the second decade of the 21st century, any type of employment had become a challenge. So reduced employment meant heightened competition, where Tunisian workers competed amongst themselves with Italian workers and with new immigrants. And of course, competition for jobs and their informal nature meant that demanding any type of labor rights was extremely difficult. Unemployment, underemployment, and informal sector employment also made it very difficult for Tunisian migrants to acquire immigration papers, permanent residency, and citizenship. Now, in Italy, access to citizenship is primarily by descent, but children of foreign nationals can apply when they turn 18, provided they meet a series of requirements that, however, are in contradiction with the realities of borderland living. So these were that they were born in Italy, that they resided there continuously, and many children had gone back and forth in their childhood, and at least one of their parents had to have been documented and legally resident in an Italian municipality at their time of birth, which was often not the case. It's also possible to apply for citizenship after 10 years of residency, but this is contingent on a minimal personal income that was very difficult to achieve in this area due to a combination of low wages, large families, but also, and most importantly, the need for this income to be officially documented. In other words, not work that's under the table. So this meant that many long-term migrants who had been in the region since the 1970s were still reliant on biannual residency permits in the early 2000s. And these residency permits, in turn, were contingent on employment. So this meant that becoming unemployed could obviously lead to the loss of livelihood, but also legal status. And this situation obviously created a flourishing black market for labor contracts. So the combination of histories of informal labor and difficulties in acquiring citizenship and residency also limited Tunisians' access to pensions. And to understand the significance of this, it's important to understand that in a highly precarious labor market, pensions represented a coveted source of state-backed income that made extended family saving strategies, such as buying a house, possible. Now, overall, the difficulties experienced by people of Tunisian descent in employment, labor rights, and welfare are not surprising, but are a typical consequence of their differential inclusion into Italy. And of course, in critical migration scholarship, the term differential inclusion refers to how migrants are fully incorporated into and essential to some areas of national life, such as the labor market, but excluded from others, such as access to political, social, and economic rights. And this was clear in the experience of Tunisian migrants in Mazara, whose labor was central to the fishing and agricultural sector, but whose immigration status made them highly vulnerable to exploitation and limited their access to welfare or other state services. However, differential inclusion into Italy does not fully explain economic precariousness of the Tunisian community in Mazara, because in this borderland context, Italian citizens also have highly precarious livelihoods. This meant that people of Tunisian descent who acquired citizenship often ended up emigrating elsewhere in Italy or Europe. And to understand the cause of this precariousness, we must once again situate the southwestern Sicilian borderland within the broader national and regional space in which it's embedded. And as I'm sure you're familiar, Sicily itself is an economically marginalized periphery within Italy, right? A region with widespread informal employment and high unemployment rates. And of course, a full discussion of the cause of this goes beyond the scope of this talk, but it's sufficient to say that one of the causes of the relative economic marginality of Sicily was its own history of incorporation into an Italian national space, with which the economic policies favored the industrial north at the expense of the south, and the broader European space, whose economic policies generally favored the economies of Northwestern countries, such as Germany. So in other words, people of Tunisian descent were differentially included into a region that was itself incorporated into Italy and Europe in a subordinate position. Now, if living in this kind of a borderland that was also an economically marginalized periphery had detrimental effects on the livelihoods of people of Tunisian descent, did Sicily's own history of internal marginalization, as well as an official politics of embracing cross-Mediterranean connections, translate into fewer instances of everyday racism towards people of Tunisian descent? In other words, did people of Tunisian descent feel welcome in Mazzara? Interestingly enough, when talking about their experiences, people of Tunisian descent often commented on receiving less instances or fewer instances of daily microaggressions compared to elsewhere in Italy, but on being more exploited and taken advantage of. So see, for instance, this quote by Ali, an Italian of Tunisian descent who'd worked both in the north and in Sicily. In the north, there's some cafes where baristas won't even look at you in the face while they serve you coffee. But at the end of the day, up there, they give you your rights. In Sicily, everyone takes advantage of you. Now, in general, people of Tunisian descent attributed the fact that everyone takes advantage of you precisely to Sicily's in-between positioning between North Africa and Europe. So see, for example, this conversation between Khaled and Majd, two middle-aged Tunisian men who had returned to their native Mahdia after years of work in different parts of Italy. Khaled, to find work in Sicily, you used to wait around in a specific area until someone would come and tell you there was a job. In the north, you just go put your name in the labor office, but in Sicily, that doesn't exist. In the north, you get your rights. In Sicily, no. Majd. In Sicily, they're like Arabs, Marocchini, they don't care. Now, this term Marocchini, it's important to understand its significance because it's widely used and was historically used in northern Italy as a deprecatory term to refer to southern Italians. But in this context, Majd was making a further play on the use of the term by arguing that Sicily's informal labor market and lack of labor rights made it similar to an Arab country in his eyes. In other words, subjects whose own belonging in Italy was being questioned through a tightening of immigration legislation still reified the notion that the island was imperfectly Italian and European, and thus in need of modernization. But what about the city's official politics of celebrating its hybrid Mediterranean culture? How did this translate into inclusion and opportunities for people of Tunisian descent? Now, in Mazzara del Vallo, there were two main types of public celebration of Mediterranean hybridity. The first was a form of urban rebranding embraced by the city in order to celebrate Mazzara del Vallo as a tourist destination and as a hub of cross-Mediterranean cooperation projects, particularly to attract funding from the EU. So an example of this was an operation of urban rebranding of the old immigrant neighborhood, the Kasbah, transformed from its reputation as an, in quotation marks, unsanitary ghetto to a symbol of the city's multiculturalism. However, this was mainly based on the celebration of hybrid architectural motifs such as the Old Center or the presence of some Tunisian businesses and cultural centers. It primarily involved Tunisian consular authorities, Tunisian investors, and a few upper middle class Tunisians in the city. And it did little to create economic opportunities for the bulk of the Tunisian community, such as support in opening small businesses or access to political representation. There was also other organizations celebrating the city's cross-Mediterranean connection, and these were mainly organizations that provided services to migrants, many of which were Catholic, which also celebrated, as I said, the city's Mediterranean hybridity. And differently from the municipality, these organizations actually provided services such as financial aid and in-kind support, after-school programs, professional training, etc., to people of Tunisian descent and to their children. However, as these two quotes by one of the representatives of these Catholic organizations suggest, these forms of direct aid often occurred alongside the reinforcement of symbolic hierarchies between Sicilians and Tunisians, according to which Sicilians were modern Mediterranean subjects, open to cultural and religious diversity, while Tunisians were difficultly adaptable or hybrid in the wrong way, right? As you see here, there's this quote, talking about the problem of foreigners present in a territory that is not their own, a sort of problem of sort of subjects that are seen as hybrid or mixed in the wrong way, in a way that generates confusion, as opposed to Sicilians who are seen as, open and ready to coexist. And I don't have the full quote here, but the rest of the quote here also includes a whole discussion of the fact that Sicilians are sort of open or modern precisely thanks to their own long history of interconnection to Tunisia and migration south. So overall, with the exception of some middle-class people of Tunisian descent who embraced Mediterraneanist politics in order to further their political careers or to launch their businesses, the bulk of the Tunisian community in Mazara del Vallo was really indifferent to these kinds of public celebrations of Mediterraneanism. Because on the one hand, they were engaged with more pressing issues of survival, but also because they saw limited advantages in engaging with the politics of celebration of multiculturalism, certainly, but did little to address their everyday material needs. So having said this, I'd like to return to some of these questions that I posed at the beginning of the talk. And of course, for the scope of time, I had to give a very quick overview, but I'm happy to go into more detail on any of these points. So really, as I started today, the questions that I asked were firstly, to what extent does the hybrid nature of borderlands such as Mazara render them a space of inclusion and opportunity for migrants? And relatedly, can public celebrations of Mediterranean mixing in borderlands such as Mazara represent a form of border thinking that creates inclusion for people of migrant descent? So my research suggests that when borderlands are also internally marginalized peripheries, this of course has negative consequences on the lives and livelihoods of migrants and people of migrant descent. Because on one hand, the effects of legal bordering of the nation state become more significant, right? So in Mazara, we've seen that precarious labor, often in the informal market, could translate into the loss of legal papers, as well as difficulties in accessing citizenship and permanent residence. And at the same time, being legally incorporated into the nation, for example, acquiring citizenship, did not necessarily translate into stable livelihoods, right, due to a more generalized economic precariousness. And finally, and relatedly, in this context, identitarian boundaries may actually be reinforced. For example, in Mazara, as I mentioned briefly, there was definitely instances of heightened competition along ethnic lines for the few available jobs. At the same time, with regards to political celebrations of mixing and hybridity emerging from borderland spaces, we've seen that in the case of Mazara, celebrations of the city's Mediterranean nature were either an aesthetic incorporation of difference, primarily aimed at promoting economic development for the city, but not explicitly seeking to provide opportunities for its Tunisian community. Or in other instances, there were forms of multiculturalism that, while celebrating mixing and interconnection, also created symbolic hierarchies between supposedly open-minded mixed Sicilians and closed-minded or at best confused Tunisians, right? Subjects that are neither here nor there. And indeed, beyond Mazara del Vallo itself, Sicilian public intellectuals and politicians have a long history of celebrating the island's connection with the southern shore of the Mediterranean, but as a means to challenge its own marginalization within Italy and Europe. So already in the late 19th century, some Sicilian Orientalist scholars celebrated the island's Arab past of the 9th and 10th centuries in order to cast it as a predecessor at the Italian Renaissance and challenge tropes around its backwardness and racial difference that had emerged precisely around Italian unification in the years immediately afterwards. In the post-World War II period, Sicilian politicians across the political spectrum celebrated and sought to develop the island's political and economic connections with North Africa, with the aim of promoting alternative regional development plans to those dependent on the central government. And most recently, since the early 2000s, many local government officials in Mazara and also elsewhere in the island have underlined its Mediterranean nature precisely with the aim of stimulating cross-border cooperation projects and perhaps attracting EU funding to do so. So in other words, celebrating Sicily's cross-Mediterranean connections and its cultural hybridity has historically been a response to the island's internal marginalization. And while of course there are forms of cross-border solidarity that emerge, celebrating the Mediterranean has not necessarily meant questioning the Mediterranean as a border or debating the significance of Italy's symbolic boundaries. So all of this to say, in conclusion, that we should not automatically assume borderland spaces to be spaces of inclusion and opportunity for migrants. Certainly, as some Tunisians in the interviews I cited mentioned, in borderlands such as Mazara, there may be fewer microaggressions than elsewhere. However, the simple, peaceful co-presence of people of different backgrounds living in the same space or the existence of hybrid cultural forms says little about material inequalities and symbolic hierarchies between people who are living in the same spaces. So rather than assume that borderlands represent spaces of inclusion and opportunity for people of migrant descent, we should instead investigate the conditions in which this might occur. The second concluding point I would like to make concerns the need to understand borderlands not simply in relation to the borderline itself, but also in relation to broader geographies of uneven development within the nation states that they're a part of. So as we've seen in the case of Mazara, this both influences the actual material opportunities accorded to migrants and people of migrant descent, but it also influences the symbolic forms of symbolic boundary drawing. So indeed in Mazara, as elsewhere in Sicily, alongside long histories of celebration of cross-Mediterranean interconnection, there's also a long history of symbolic differentiation from Tunisians, precisely as a means to affirm the modernity, Italianness, and Europeanness of Sicilians. And finally, the last point I would like to make is that, as we've seen in the case of Mazara, celebrations of an intermediate and mixed borderland identity do not necessarily constitute a form of border thinking that recognizes and centers marginalized populations. However, I would argue that we can actually find forms of this border thinking elsewhere. For instance, in cross-border solidarity movements, such as those providing assistance to migrants at sea, or cross-Mediterranean anti-austerity networks. And these sorts of networks celebrate the Mediterranean interconnection while also challenging the fortification of material borders and the hardening of symbolic boundaries of the nation, and also work to address uneven power relations between people of European and North African descent. So with this, I'll close my part of the presentation, and I very much look forward to hearing your comments. And this is, as I said, as Bill mentioned, this is part of a work in progress, part of the book project that I'm working on. So I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and comments on this.
Ilaria, thank you. That was fantastic, and you're perfectly on time. So what I'll do is, just so we make sure that we can stick to time, why don't we meet back here in 5 minutes? That's 8 past the hour. And then we'll leave the floor then to Encarna for our discussion comments. Okay, all right, I'll see you back in a few minutes. So we're back. What I'd like to do now is, I can actually stop sharing. This is just so everyone can has a quick look at some nice work that both of you have been up to. What I'd like to do now is open the floor to Encarna. I'm sure you have many things you'd like to say. So what we can do is maybe open it up for about 10 minutes and then open the floor for a Q&A. And if anybody over this period of time wants to raise any questions in the Q&A, there's that little button at the bottom of the screen. You can do that and I can pick those up later. All right, so without any further waiting, Encarna, please begin whenever you're ready.
Yes, hello everyone, and hello William and Johanna, Mia, and thank you for the invitation and being part of the conversation. And my special thanks also to Ilaria Giglioli for sharing your paper and your thoughts on the Mediterranean and how to think the Mediterranean from a Southern European perspective. I feel reminded of Albert Camus a few days ago. I don't know why, all of a sudden he came up again. And it is a kind of a similar project when we engage with the Mediterranean, because what we are trying to do is actually to create other boundaries, I would say, to a hegemonic European project that usually inscribes itself in a specific historiography, very often also, of course, as especially post-colonial and decolonial thinkers have inspired us to think about, and also theories of the global South, that this Europe very much established itself by forgetting a lot of its own history, and especially its colonial and imperial history, its history of transatlantic slave trade, and so on. So when we look at the kind of these borders that are Europe, which we never know where they start and where they end, no? In Germany, where I'm based, there's always the discussion, is Turkey part of Europe or not? Is Russia then part of Europe? So we do see that the kind of entity we are talking about is one that is in constant dispute and negotiations, and forms part of a specific nation-state historiography that then it's outplayed in a different nation-state in different manner. If I look at the state I am from also, which is Spain, you do have a historiography that in the 19th century starts to be a lot challenged by other notions of a nationality, like the Catalan, the Basque, or the Galician, but even the Andalusian, where I am actually part of. So in a way, we have a similar kind of negotiations within Italy, and Antonio Gramsci has written a lot about the Southern question, no? And how the Southern question, especially his positionality as a Sardinian, wasn't being thought of. And when he thinks about the Fiat industry and the project of modernity in northern Italy, what he encounters is a kind of, what I would say, internal coloniality. Of course, we can discuss, is this coloniality? No, but it is a kind of internal coloniality, because the South, which is then immigrating to the Fiat industry, car industry in the North, is being perceived also as the other of the nation. So I think it's, and when you look at Andalusia, we have a similar kind of negotiations going around. How far are those liminal regions part of a nation-state project that is the Italian nation-state project? And if you look at the current political debates with the Lega Nord and so on, you kind of see it recreated. So I think the question then to look at these liminal regions, regions where a history that is an entangled history, a history where you have populations also in southern Italy that speak even different dialects or different languages that relate to different regions. That might be Tunisia. It would be one question. Is there a kind of a specific dialect or language that has appeared in this encounter that is in the region for centuries, not just for the last decades? So, and it shows us then how this project of homogeneity of a nation that is very often built within the European context as a white nation, a Christian nation, and one that doesn't talk either about or especially in the South, I would say there's always the aim, and by saying the South, I'm referring now to the Southern European, but also the Eastern European parts. There's always an aim of the nation state to become part of this European project of industrialization and modernity. And what it's been always challenged from the Southern and Eastern perspective is that you don't really fit in. And when you look at this kind of negotiations, then you see, of course, that the voice of Spain or Poland or Italy, which are very different, but they don't play the same role when the project of Europe, and especially the European Union, is being negotiated. So by saying that, that doesn't mean that those regions, of course, as you rightly show, are part of imperial projects, are part of new negotiations of this Europe, and also take part, especially in Italy now with the right-wing government, with the very decisive policies against migrants, that they can get votes with this kind of project. So looking at the Mediterranean then from the Sicilian part, and the kind of encounter that you try to trace and also understand, which you describe as Tunisian and Italian. And one of my first question is it always Tunisian and Italian, or is it something else that it's being negotiated? And how can we look at it? Because of course, I think that you do have different levels in which one is the negotiation of nation states belonging, but on the other, you have also local belongings or local encounters, interactions that might talk about a different language. I don't know Sicily. I haven't been to Sicily. I would have loved to go to Sicily. And some of your images reminded me of Andalusia, for example. And what I see in Andalusia, which is not a general, and it's a very kind of, let's say, anecdotal observation of mine, is you have a kind of a youth culture that tries to situate itself differently. One kind of history that we are, I say we as an Andalusian, I try to put more at the forefront is not only the Muslim history that's part of the Andalusian culture. So one or other question would be also, what is it about this multi-faith space, Sicily? You know, how are those cultures being also not just brought by new migratory movements, but how are they part of the place historically, and how are this kind of sites of belonging being reactivated by new collectives? And so you have this youth culture that takes not only Muslim references, but there are also youth culture that takes African references, or Black African references. For example, the fact that your curly hair is not anymore an issue, and you really try to show this belonging by having an afro. And those things are really contesting also the European project. And in Andalusia for a very long time, a lot of people being critical about the European project would define themselves as being Africans and not Europeans, which of course you could say, oh, yeah, as you rightly say, show, and that would be the second part, is how the kind of welfare state, in a way, that is negotiated also in the South, shows in a way, on the one side, the belonging to the nation state, because it's part of an Italian social state. Therefore, the comparison between what is possible in the North and what is not possible in the South, or what hasn't been implemented in the same way, which is a state organization also of labor market recruitment, of social benefits, and so on, all of, as you rightly say, a precarious form of organizing of labor, which still persists and hasn't been changed. And it's characteristic for countries in the south and the east of Europe, because of different reasons. I mean, East and South are quite different, but we could compare the precarious labor situation in Italy with the one in Spain, where you do have, for example, also, especially then in the South, a very big size, by 50% almost, of young people being unemployed, and the most part of the population living under precarious working conditions. What does it mean? You don't have a regulation of your salary, you have several jobs, and of course, you don't have a guarantee to be employed for a longer period, or there's always an uncertainty. So, and what you have at the same time, and you've been speaking about it, is this kind of local networks or structures, sometimes family, friends, sometimes acquaintances that you have, that actually reorganize the inclusion into the labor market, into the housing market. And in the Spanish context, there have been a very interesting moment when after the financial crisis in 2006-07 and eviction of several families from the flats and apartments, also in cities, not only in the south, in different cities, in different places, you had the organization of a platform of neighbors that were supporting the families in refusing to be evicted, in giving them other places, or try to support them in finding other places to live, and so on. And this platform is a transcultural platform. And that tells us something about how neighborhoods then organize on the level, not only to say, well, you know, in the north, in the south is different. And of course, there's let's say the state interferes into the organization of life in a different way, and to the sustain and reproduction of life in a different way. But then you have these networks that organize very often this immediacy of reproduction. And so that would be also a question that I have, because you show us in a way a critical analysis of the situation, which is also, I think, very clear and interesting to see the differences that are being noticed. But at the same time, the question would be, what kind of networks are established by these groups that transform this locality? And there's your baby. So on the other hand, I think that what it would be interesting also is to see how this negotiation of the nation state in the south, by comparing it to in the citation to the being from Morocco, also, but to the south. So it's being stated by two members, I think they're Tunisians, that this is actually Sicily is not working like Europe. And how do you negotiate those comparisons? Because in a way, what it's being discussed there is, one is the modern state, and the others are, I don't know, what is it? What are the others? And what does it tell us also about the local fabric also, and how it's negotiated? And I think I've done my 10 minutes because I don't have the watch here. So,
that's actually perfect. Thank you so very, very much.
Yeah.
So I think what I have here from the questions is about pertains to how exactly, are there any sort of forms, is there anything from a social perspective, a cultural perspective in this area of Mazara del Vallo that gives an alternative identity that people actually embrace, that is beyond the Tunisian and Sicilian that you've talked about? That's what I got from you, Encarna. And the second is, what kind of networks do these create locally? And then how do these feed into other forms of, the way that the state itself is being staged?
Perfect, thank you. Sorry, just Bill, to clarify, are these additional questions that you're adding, or are you summarizing?
I'm summarizing. I'm just summarizing, if that's okay.
Oh, okay,
with
okay,
you,
perfect.
and Carmen.
Okay, yeah, absolutely.
Because I've been taking notes while you were speaking.
Yeah, so should I respond now? Yeah, okay, perfect. So yeah, so I think first of all, it's interesting. I mean, I think I maybe painted somewhat of a pessimistic, I guess, view of the sort of forms of celebration of the Mediterranean, and I think there are also a lot of spaces of possibility of organizing and forging alternative identities, which I didn't talk about in detail, but certainly, I mean, I think there certainly is an embracing of and public embracing of, I would say, definitely of a sort of local regional identity, but also a celebration of, and I think in this way maybe similarly to Andalusia, of the region's Arab past, sort of the 9th and 10th century Arab history in the island, but also the sort of history of, and I didn't get into it here, but I do elsewhere in my work, of Sicilian southward migration to colonial Tunisia and the kinds of sort of exchanges that happen in this context. And there's a lot of, also self, I guess, sort of rhetorical identification as, we are absolutely, we're African, we're Arab. I mean, in a sort of public, both in a sort of everyday language, but also in kind of public celebrations. And of course, you can see, hybrid cultural forms. I mean, from the fact of like couscous being like a dish of the Tabani region, right? I mean, that absolutely speaks to its connections with North Africa. And so I think there are, of course, all these forms, which I do create these sort of forms of borderland hybridity. I guess the point that I was trying to make is just that essentially, I think sometimes, it's easy to sort of stop at this level and to then make assumptions about the space being one in which, for example, the borders of Europe are the material and symbolic borders of Europe are contested. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that there can be a sort of celebration of hybridity and of cross-Mediterranean connection, and a specific celebration of a local identity that's different from the national one. But that often happens alongside also a sort of differentiation from sort of even deeper south. And one thing that I trace sort of historically in Sicily is precisely how the comparison with Tunisia has served. In a way, on the one hand, there's a process of rhetorical differentiation from Tunisia as a sort of means to assert the modernity and full Europeanness of Sicily, but also at the same time, a strategic celebration of cross-Mediterranean connections, once again, but all of these are really aimed at sort of centering this region in the Mediterranean, centering it for European, I guess, geostrategical interests in the region, sort of creating a new type of centrality. So it's interesting because it's a way of sort of contesting, in a way, a kind of understanding of Europe that often sees the Mediterranean as the past, right? Sort of the Mediterranean as the history of Europe, but now the epicenter is the north. So it is a recentering, but I would argue that it's a recentering that also, I guess, that doesn't necessarily, fully question contemporary forms of boundary drawing. At the same time, of course, there's forms of from local everyday relations between people of Sicilian and Italian descent, to forms of political organizing like the ones that you mentioned in Spain that exist. Absolutely, all these types of forms of from everyday relationships to organizing do exist. And I do see in these kinds of spaces the forging of a sort of, I guess you could call it, a borderland identity that does question broader forms of boundary drawing. I think the point that I want to make is just that when looking at these kinds of when looking at celebrations of a sort of hybrid borderland identity or celebrations of a long history of interconnection with the Mediterranean, it's really important to look at the sort of, I guess, issues of material inequalities and symbolic hierarchies that exist between the participants in these kinds of spaces, and also understand the broader aims, because it's very different, for example, to talk about Mediterranean interconnection as part of, for example, cross-Mediterranean anti-austerity solidarity network, as there have been many, and particularly maybe not as much now as in, for example, the 2011, 2012, those years, but there's a long history of that. There's definitely a sort of politics of claiming a hybrid identity, which goes precisely against the kind of, sort of explicitly nationalist politics that are emerging in Italy as much as elsewhere. So I think these forms emerge, but the point that I want to make is that they're also forms of celebrating mixing and interconnection that while they do create, in a sense, it's a different narrative from certain sort of narratives of Europe, founded Europe as a kind of, as a space that doesn't have a connection with the Southern Mediterranean. We shouldn't necessarily assume these to be, I guess, forms of celebration of interconnection that do create inclusion or that do open up the symbolic boundaries of the nation. So that's mainly the point that I want to get at this. And what I've said elsewhere is that, in fact, there's a much longer history of celebration of Mediterranean interconnection as sort of part of Italian and actually French, also colonial projects in North Africa, where the celebration of Mediterranean interconnection is part of a means of sort of legitimizing presence there, and the kind of, looking back to the long history of interconnection to argue that in a sort of support of European colonial projects. So in that sense, I guess the work I'm doing is kind of a caution against celebrating any kind of form or considering any kind of form of celebration of interconnection as something that is breaking boundaries, while at the same time recognizing that it has the potential to do so in precisely the kinds of forms of everyday relations or solidarity organizing that you are mentioning.
So we're out of time. I know you're out of time. I just want to say, if anybody from our audience has perhaps one question, if there's like a burning question they have, I just want to at least open that up for anyone. If not, I do have one last comment. I think that's actually quite relevant considering all the discussions we're having about the Mediterranean or in relation to the Öresund. But if no one has that pressure to speak, I'll just say it right now. I think what's really fascinating is that the way that you frame this as a sort of strategic use of the borderlands, strategic Mediterraneanism. And I think one of the interesting questions that I think your presentation really poses is it possible to think about strategic Mediterraneanism in the context of the Öresund region? Because I think the history of the Öresund also, as we learned from our last session, and previous ones before that as well, is that there's a shifting of the way in which the region itself has been described, and in terms of what is included in it, what is not included in it. Is it the Öresund region? Is it part of Greater Copenhagen? And these shifting ways of talking about the region, I think, fit very well in with the way that what you're describing. I think there's a celebration of a certain Southern Scandinavian identity in many ways, but then there's also, I think you can see this as a way of perhaps also, and this is something I think that's an open question, perhaps reinforcing distinctions between different groups of people in southern Scandinavia as well, and that might be a way to think through some of these questions in the region. And I think that's actually really great that you've brought that here, because I think that's maybe not something that is so often talked about when we think about the Öresund.
And that's really interesting. I have to admit, I don't know a lot about, apart having visited the region a few times, but I don't know a lot about these sort of politics, and I'd actually be very, very interested in learning more about it, and thinking also about these kinds of similarities.
Yeah. Well, our time is up. I know you have to go. So what I'll say here is, I just want to say thank you again, Ilaria. Thank you, Encarna, for this great discussion. The next meeting we have is on May 9th, next Tuesday, or not next Tuesday, excuse me, on Tuesday, May 9th, in a few weeks. This will be with Larissa Fleischmann. We'll talk about attempts to fence in more than human borderlands of disease in Germany's eastern borderlands of Poland, or with Poland. And this will be with someone here who's today, Tracy Wilson. So thank you, Tracy, for being here. We hope to see you all again. And have a great week. So goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.